All right, everyone. A good evening. It is Wednesday, August 16th. It's about 8 minutes after 6 p.m. Central Time. This is session 2 of the Intro to Coding Live JavaScript, the August session. So welcome back, everyone. I hope the first night was informative and that you got something out of it. I appreciate the large crowd that hung out afterwards to ask some questions. We didn't cover anything earth-shattering. A lot of it was just kind of personal experience questions. Nothing that I feel like we need to rehash at the start of this session. But again, I'll offer that pretty much every night of class. So hang out for 5, 10, 15 minutes afterwards to answer any questions anyone wants to ask me after the fact. So we finished up on Monday night. The last section we covered was functions. And so everything we do for the rest of this class is going to be working in functions. Every time we solve a challenge and you open up, if anyone looked at any of the challenge lists, they kind of give you a
I'll be right here. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'm gonna mute someone here real quick. All right. So that basically, like every time we go to solve a challenge, if you looked in any of the Replit challenges, there's already a skeleton built out for you there to like start help guiding you in the early ones, and those are all in a method format. So technically, we probably could solve some of the challenges without having to write a function, but we always want to do coding best practices, and we'll talk about that tonight. So we want to solve all of these challenges in the form of a function. All right. So just kind of going over the basic format here. Remember, so we have, this is the old way of doing it, and we now have the new way of doing it, which is the ES6 or the ECMA 2015, which is like the most recent version of JavaScript. And we have the fat arrow function. And the important thing to remember, and I'm not going to be a stickler in this class about, oh, you have to write it the new way or you have to write it the old way. I will flip back and forth between them, just depending on how I feel about it. But I'm always happy to write it both ways for you once we solve the challenge so that you can see what it looks like. Because typically the insides of this function are all going to stay the same. It's really like this first line up here that looks different. And the important thing to remember is this function adds two numbers together and returns the sum. This function does the exact same thing, even though it looks a little bit different. And also this one does the same thing as well. And for purposes of not getting overwhelmed while we're first learning how to code, I wouldn't pay a ton of attention to an anonymous function. Like, you're not going to need to know that or how to use that syntax to make it into Code Platoon, or honestly even to make it through Code Platoon. It's just it's something else that's out there. And if you're only going to focus on one, though, I would say focus on like the fat arrow function. All right. Any questions about functions before we get into the new stuff for the evening? All right, cool. So we're going to jump into control flow. And control flow is conditional logic. It's how we tell a computer to make a decision based on the information that's been provided. So when you want to control a computer or control how a computer goes through your program, use control flow. This evaluates to either true or false, so our Boolean values, and it allows us to select different outcomes depending on user input or the result of a computation. All right, and so we see three progressively more complex things happening here, right? This, I will point out, take special note of this, because whoever the people were that invented all of the different software, like basically computer languages, no one agrees on else if. So else if in JavaScript is like an elif. In Python, I think, if I remember correctly, different languages will have different ways of doing the else if. But for our use here in JavaScript, it is if, else, and then else if. And so let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on with that. So if I say, let's do two variables here, like we'll say num1 equals 7, and we'll let num2 equal 23. If I start a conditional value and I say if num1 equals num2, we'll then console.log these numbers are equal. All right, does anyone pick up somewhere where I made a mistake in this already? And this goes back to something that we talked about with equality on the first night.
Strictly equal?
Yep. So on line 5, I only did equal, right? And I mentioned that when in doubt, we always want to default to being more restrictive than less restrictive when we're writing our solutions. So I want to do strictly equal, because technically, if I change num2 to the string, I'm not even comparing numbers anymore, but this will give me a true, and this statement is not true because this is not a number, it's a string, right? So now if I run this, nothing will happen, right? Because I've not given it an else case yet. But if I do make these numbers equal, so 7 and 7, they are strictly equal to each other. Taking a second here. All right, so these numbers are equal. So I have basically, remember, so computer reads code from the first line down, right? So we take num1, it's a variable, we declare it, we assign it the value of 7. We take the variable num2, we declare it, we assign it the value of 7. We come down in here to our if statement, and we're asking if this is strictly equal. And so what happens inside the computer is when these two numbers are strictly equal, this resolves to the Boolean value true. Whoops. Right? And we have to have a true statement in here to get inside the code of the if statement, right? And so now if I take something like this and I say console.log these numbers are not equal, right? Now it's the same thing if I go back to my evaluation up here, right? So now it's saying if this is true, execute this code, else execute this code, right? And so there's only one possible combination of numbers to do this, where like basically like 8 and 8, 9 and 9, there's only one possible combination of all the numbers out there for each number that will basically get you into the if statement. And this is it. So if I run this again, I'll still get these numbers are equal. But if I take this and I bump this to an 8, right, this resolves to false. And then notice how when I do this, so it's going to say unreachable code detected, because when I actually have the word false in here, the Boolean value false, it'll never ever go inside the if statement. But now I get these numbers are not equal. All right. And so whenever our evaluation is true, we will go inside the if statement. And then if it's false, we'll fall into the else statement. Now, the third thing that we were looking at over here was the else if statement, right? And so an else if statement is the ability to give additional checks, right? So I could do something like this, where num1 is triple equal to num2, right? And then also say, and num1 is triple equal to 7, right? And because, remember, when we do an and, everything, both of these have to evaluate to true for it to be true, right? So this will evaluate to true, 8 is equal to 8, but 8 is not equal to 7. So when I run this, I would say these numbers are not equal. So I should see the same message, right? Now I can do something like this, where I say, else if, let's see here, num1 is triple equal to num2. And now I could say, let's say this. Right? So now when I run this code, right, these are both equal. So this is true and this is false. So we're going to skip this line of code. We're going to come to the else if. The 8 and 8, this is true. This is the only condition I have to hit for this one. So it'll now say these numbers are equal. These numbers are equal. Now, if I come back up here and I change these both to 7, these numbers are both 7, right? So now num1 and num2 are equal to each other, and num1 is triple equal to 7. So we hit this top line. You will use a lot of this to, I mean, this is how you tell your computer to make decisions based on different information that it's provided. So like large pieces of software are filled with hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of conditional statements, telling it to take different paths through the software that you've written. Any questions on if else, and then if else? And I will also say that you can chain an unlimited amount of else ifs in here, right? So I could also say something like, right? And so, and I could keep going for different possible combinations. And I'm just doing strictly equal here. So I could also do something where we could say num1 is greater than 9, right? And so now, basically, if we run this and say that 7, we get that. If we do 8, right? So this is true, this is false. This is true, this is false. So we'll skip both of these and then we'll end up down here. So we'll say these numbers are equal, right? But if I turn these into 80s, right? Now this is true, this is false, this is true, and this is true. Let me update this. Right? So these numbers are equal and greater than 9, right? And so we can continue to build out increasingly more complex stuff. I don't want to pile too much on, but these can also be nested inside of each other, right? So like inside of an else if statement, like you can start to write another if statement. When we start to get into really complex logic like that, there's something that we run into, which is again called a code smell, where technically your code may work, but it may not be the best way to write the code. So if you were to run into a situation where if you were within an if else statement and you were trying to write another if statement inside of that one, sometimes that may be the only way to do it, but you should stop and think about it and really think to find out if there is another way to do it, because generally once you start adding additional nested conditionals inside there, things can get really difficult to read. All right. So any questions in here?
I think I have a question.
Go.
Is there ever a case where it makes sense to have like one parameter? So if you just, so my understanding of JavaScript, if you just did if num1 and close the parentheses, that would equal true in Boolean value. So if you were to have a conditional of, if you're just trying to check, see if you have a value that's not null or undefined, or zero, I guess, is there ever a case that makes sense to just have one parameter, or is it always a comparison to a known value?
No. So what you're talking about is the concept of truthy or falsy. And we have a session on that. We're not quite there yet, so we're definitely jumping ahead. So I believe, what is it, session 5, 6? Yeah, so in session 7, we're so next, let's see here, so 4, 5. So this will be like 2 Mondays from now. We're going to talk about falsy and truthy and what you just talked about. So no, that is definitely valid. And it does get used. And I'm glad that you kind of circled around and brought up the part about null as well, because you do have to be careful, because just because you have a value there, or like just one conditional, does not necessarily mean that it will always evaluate to true.
Okay, thanks.
Right. And so, right, because like if we just do something like this, so if num1 is right, so because num1 is a value, right, we get true, but I believe if so, like if we did turn it to null, right, like it'll be false. Also the number 0 will represent as false, and we'll get more into this. But yeah, just because there's one conditional here doesn't mean that it'll always go to true. But we'll talk about that here towards the end of class. All right. So the other thing I did want to show right now before we move on to iteration, though, is a ternary operator. Has anyone ever heard of that before? And if not, no worries, because you're about to.
Think I did once. Is that the contraction where you contract the whole thing into just one sentence?
Yep. Yeah. So we can take an if else statement and move it into one line of code, right? So I can do something like this. So I can say if num1 triple equals num2, right? Log equal else they're not equal. All right, so if I run this right now, I should get they are equal. And I do. If I change that to one of them to a different number, I'll get they are not equal. So a ternary operator is a way to take basically an if else statement. So you do have to have an if and an else case with this, and move it into one line, right? So right? And I'm gonna assign it to a variable here. You don't have to, but you usually won't see a ternary out in the wild unless it's assigned to a variable. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna say num1 triple equals num2, right? So this part right here, it's still involved. And then instead of an if statement, we're going to put a question mark here. And just like we do in an if else statement, we give it the true value and the false value. Right? So I can say something like this. Right? And if I comment this out, and then I console.log ternary and run it, I get the same things here, right? And the same thing, if I turn this into an 81, I'll get they are not equal. So this can be turned into this, right? And so if you see this out there, this right here is a ternary operator, right? And all it is a shorthand for a simple if else statement. All right. Any questions on ternary operators? Okay. So the next section is loops. Now, there are multiple ways to write loops in JavaScript, and we're going to talk about each of the ways of doing that. Just like anything else, there are going to be, because there are multiple ways to do it, just like there are multiple ways to write functions. I would like you, while you're solving the challenges, to focus on writing full loops. All right. Be it a while loop or a for loop. I would prefer that you do that versus using one of the built-in methods that we're going to talk about in the next section, which would be like a for each or a dot map, which basically hides all the syntax and the guts of what you're doing in the loop. And in coding, we call that abstracting it away. So it does the same thing, but you don't actually write the code to see it happen. And so, until you understand what a loop is and why you would use it, I would prefer that you practice using, like, actually writing out full loops. Once you get out into the real world, you start writing production software, you won't use loops as often. Whenever you write a loop, you can do the exact same thing with a lot less code, using a dot map or a for each built-in function in JavaScript or whatever language that you're using. But for now, while we're learning, and they'll do the same thing, they'll continue that in the pre-work. And if you go to Code Platoon or probably most other boot camps, get used to understanding how the actual loops work. So as far as loops, they can execute a block of code a number of times. As long as the condition is true, the block of code will continue to execute. When the condition becomes false, the code after the end of the loop will be executed. So the first loop we're going to look at is a while loop. So a while loop is the word while and then your run condition. So if we look at this as a example, right? So we set let a equal 0 while a is less than 100, continue to execute this code. And then every time we execute the code, we take a and we add 1 to it. All right. And this is also some interesting shorthand right here. So let's go ahead and talk about that right now as well. So I can do, so if I say, so we'll go let a equal 1, right? And if I say console.log a plus 1, what does everyone think I'm going to get over here in the console? No, it's not a trick question yet.
Two.
Yep,
Two.
I'm gonna get 2. All right, so let me just comment this out real quick, right? So there's my 2. I get a plus 1. Now, if I console.log a second time, what is a going to be equal to?
2.
Okay, I've got some 2s and I've got some
3.
and a 3. All right, a is equal to 1, right? Because all I've done here is console.log the value of a, which is 1. I've assigned it a value of 1. So I've basically an a resolves to 1, and I'm adding 1 plus 1, which is 2. However, I never reassigned the value of a. So great guesses. I appreciate the participation there. And so if I want to basically permanently increase the value of it, what I'm looking at is I have to write something like this. So a equals a plus 1, right? And now I'm reassigning value of a to a plus 1. Right. So now when I do it, oops, cannot access a. Before that, sorry, I need to, oh, how do I do? Did I on line 27? It won't let me do it that way because it's this. So basically what I'm looking at is if I do a plus or a equals, so I have to reassign it a plus 1, sorry. And I do this, and then I console.log a, it's 2, right? And it doesn't matter how many times I console log a, I'm just console logging a. I have now reassigned the value. Now, in a while loop, we saw something like this, plus equals 1, right? So I can write this in shorthand. So instead of basically reassigning the value of a to a plus 1, I can write this way. So a plus equals 1, and it also works for all the other mathematical operators. And this is shorthand for saying reassign a to the value of a plus 1, right? So now if I run this again, I still get all 2s. And specifically for like addition and subtraction, you'll see this in loops as we go here. I can make this even shorter by doing a plus plus to add 1 to the current value, or a minus minus to decrement or subtract the current value. Right, so I still get my 2s here. So let's go ahead and make a note about this. So a equals a plus 1, a plus equals 1, and a plus plus. These all do the same thing, right? It's just different ways of writing. All right, so now inside my loop, and we'll just comment this one out right for right now. And so we'll say let a equal 1. And we're going to say while a, oops, sorry, is less than, we won't do 100. We'll say 15. I want you to do a plus plus. And I also want to, well, console.log a so that we see the count actually going. All right, so now when we run this, there's my count 1 through 14. Right, and so remember, once we hit, well, it's less than this. So if I wanted to count from 1 to 15, there's 2 ways I could do it. I could say less than 16, or the more common way would be less than or equal to 15. All right, and so there's my count from 1 to 15. All right, and remember, and it says here, when when the condition becomes false, the code after the end of the loop will be executed. Right, so if I do a console.log down here and say loop over, right, it isn't going to read straight through, typo there, and so it won't say like 1 and then loop over. It's going to count from 1 to 15. It's going to do all of its executions, and then once this actually so this last a turns into 16, this statement resolves to false. We skip over the code or any future execution of that code, and then we continue on with the program, right? And so if we do that, we could say loop over, or we could even write something like this. So we could, just so that we know we're telling the truth, right? So let's go ahead and console.log a. All right, so there's 16. And so we talked about string literals yesterday, right? So a is equal to 16. So that code is executed. So now we could say while a is greater than 0, console.log a, and then say a minus minus. Right, so there's my first loop counting up, and then there's my second loop counting back down. All right, so, and then come down here. Right, and so comes in, code executes, code after the loop executes, next loop executes, code after the loop executes, in order. Any questions on a while loop?
Could you give a short example on when or why you would use a while loop over the other ones?
So you would use, I mean, a lot of instances, a while loop and a for loop are interchangeable, right? And and we're going to talk about a for loop next. So, and are you familiar with a for loop already, Roger?
A little bit. Having an initiator and then counting, having it, loop as
Yep.
well as,
Yeah, and so whenever, like, usually a for loop, you're going to be counting every time. A while loop is I'm using it in the same, like, I'm going to write a for loop that does this exact same thing next. But let's think of like this way, and this is why where you would specifically use a while loop is, let's say, let's play tic-tac-toe, right? And we write a while let's play, and then we can say loop through playing the game. Each player gets a turn until draw or win, right? And then ask, do you want to continue to play, right? And now we can say, let's play equal true, right? And so now I am going to play, like, I am going to start up my program. I'm going to my while loop. Let's play. By default is set to true. The game is going to start playing, right? With 2 players, computer, whatever. We play through the entire game. And then I ask the user a question, do you wish to continue to play? And they will say yes or no, true or false. If they hit true, we go back up to the start of our while loop, we reset the game and we play another game. How many times will this loop through?
Until it turns false.
Correct. Right? So there is no count. I could play 1 game, I could play 1 billion games. As long as it's true, it's going to continue to go. Right? And as soon as the player says, I don't want to play anymore, and I say false, right? Like, then basically write goodbye message. Thanks for playing. All right. Now, with a for loop, and what we're going to talk about next, it is always going to have a count. And so that's like the main situational difference between a for loop and a while loop. A while loop, you'll use it whenever you use a for loop. And whenever you're counting, and I'll show you why I typically use for loops, because it takes all of these things like let A equal 1, and then because this while loop is specifically counting up, right? But like if I was doing something like this and I had a count in here, then I have to write a specific line of code to remember to increment, right? Because if I do something like this, right? If I get rid of all of this other stuff for a second here, can anyone tell me what's going to happen when I run this code?
It's gonna print out 1, right?
Yeah. How many times is it going to print out 1?
Infinitely.
Yep. Infinite within the constraint of until I have enough 1s in my RAM that it crashes my replet, right? So if I hit this run button, oh, I've got a token somewhere that I didn't comment out right there. So now if I hit the run button, there I am. I am just looping. And look at my resources down here. You slowly start to see my RAM bar fill up, and this is, I'm just logging the value 1, so it's going to take forever to burn through it. But like eventually I would run my computer out of memory, and then the whole thing crashes, and it'll tell me I have an infinite loop. And the reason I have an infinite loop is because I am not moving towards my false case. Like I am not moving towards the termination point. Right. So this is gonna yell at me for forever. It'll probably crash out before it's all said and done. Let me just refresh it here. I see a hand up.
Yeah. How do you comment out quickly? What was the code
Yep.
for that?
So for Windows, it is Control / the button underneath the question mark. If you are a Mac user, it is Command /. Right. So you can highlight multiple lines and you can comment and uncomment.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right. So I always need to be moving towards terminating my loop. Otherwise, it'll go on for forever. Right. And so, but that is why we use like a while loop versus a for loop, is this specific instance right down here. All right. So next is a for loop. So let me go ahead and comment this out. I'm going to leave this uncommented so it's lit up a little bit better. All right. So let's take a look at a for loop. And so basically it does the exact same thing as a while loop when it's counting, but it takes all the different parts of the while loop, and as we basically count in the while loop, and it moves it onto a single line, right? So the initialized variable counter, or what we call the incrementer, and which is the I is for increment, the run condition, and then the increment decrement counter. All right, and so when we look at this over here, this is pretty much the same thing we did in the while. So let's go ahead and write that over here. So I can say for let I equal 1, I less than or equal to 15, and then I plus plus. So I'm counting by 1. Right? So console.log I. Right? So this does the exact same thing. Right? A equal to 1, count while A is less than or equal to 15, increment the value of A by 1 each time we loop through. Let I equal 1, keep counting while I is less than or equal to 15, and then I plus plus, which means add 1 to the value of I each time we loop through. Right? So if I comment this out and I run this code, there's my count from 1 to 15. All right. And so the for loop is doing the exact same thing that while loop did while counting. Now, same thing. We use this specifically like when we're counting, it cleans everything up, it puts it on one line. I wouldn't try and figure out how to hardwire like a for loop to look like a while loop in this scenario. I would use a while. Any questions on a for loop? And don't worry about it. You're going to see plenty of these in the challenges. Not a ton of looping in the first night, like tonight, but like by the challenges that you have on Thursday, and then like the following week, I mean, almost all of them will have some form of looping in. Go for it.
So will you always start with let for the for loops, or is there other ways?
You could technically do var, but I would let is like the standard way of doing it. So
Okay.
this is the way you should be writing it.
Okay.
All right. Now, the other two loops we'll talk about here are a for in loop and a for of loop. A for in loop is just a for loop with specific syntax in it for iterating through an object. Right, so we can grab, we won't grab it because the commas never carry over correctly. Right, but so let's go ahead and create an object here real quick. So we could say, let object equal, what did we set our key values to over here? 1, 2, 3, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. 1, Alpha, 2, Bravo, 3, Charlie. Right, and so we grab this and we can say for let key and object. Right, and technically we could call this ham if we want to, right? Like it doesn't necessarily give us the correct thing. And actually I should be careful before I say that this is something specific. Let's just get through it first, right? So what this is going to do is for if there's 3 keys in here, this is going to loop through 3 times, right? So I can say console.log, right? And I can say hello. And if I do this, I should just see hello 3 times. And I do, because there's 3 keys in there. Now, if I want to start to see things, right? So I could say key, right? And I get 1, 2, 3, just the keys. And we talked about this on Monday. right? If we want to look at a specific item inside of an array, we need to access it by the index value, so 0, 1, 2, 3, so on. If we want to look at something inside of an object, if we want to see the value, we need to access it by the key, right? So I can wrap this in square brackets and I can say object key. And there's my values, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. So I could then, if I want to go a step further, I could say something like this. Right, and I can do something like this. So I could call this platoons. Right, the key one has a value of alpha inside our object called, whoops, object. Oh, I can't reference the object that way. I'm sorry. I'm not getting the name. I'm dragging the entire object into it. So got too fancy for myself. So we could just cut it off here. Right, so key one has the value of alpha, key two has the value of Bravo. So now I've used basically a for in loop. So for in, which only works for objects. And I've iterated through each key in the object, and I've used it to access the name of the key and the value of that key. And so we talked about control flow. That is a basic building block. Like an if statement is a basic building block, and basically like a loop is a basic building block. We can also combine these building blocks, right? So I could say if key is equal to 2, I think that'll work. This may not look like a number to it. And then if we move this console statement in here, well, let's see if this will work or if this will yell at. Nope, it's yelling at me because that isn't it. So I think it, even though it looks like a number, it treats it as a string. So let's try that. There it is. Right. So now we loop through, but we only took action when we met our parameter, right? So like when we met our conditional evaluation. And we could add an else statement in here. Right. Right, so we still looping through 3 times. The first time the key is not equal to the string of 2, right? So this didn't meet our condition. It did meet our condition, didn't meet our condition, right? So now we've taken 2 building blocks, a iteration and a second building block of control flow, and basically built something a little bit more complex. And the next thing we would do is take a third building block, which is our functions, and we would encapsulate this whole thing in a function so that we could reuse it whenever we need to without having to rewrite this code over and over again. All right. Lastly, we have a for of, which is it does the exact same thing as a for loop, or a for in does for an object, for of does an array. You are always welcome to do a for of, but if you are in, same with this, if you are confused by either of these, just do a for loop, right? Like I'm going over these once a lot of times in class, excuse me, where I could use one of these. I'm going to continue to hammer on using like a for loop or a while loop until people are comfortable with them. All right, so same thing here. Believe, let's see, so let item in array. All right, so now we've iterated through the array, right? Like remember, arrays are 0 index. So the first time through, we grab something at the 0 index. The second time through, we grab it at the 1 index. Third time through, we grab it at the 2 index, right? So this array has a length of 3. There are 3 items inside it. The indexes are 0, 1, and 2. Computers always start counting at 0, right? And we could do the same thing with just a traditional for loop. So for let I equal 0, I less than array of cats dot length I plus plus. All right, and we still get Mo, Todd, and Nugget out of here. All right, so this is, again, this is a cleaner way of doing it. This is a little bit more complicated way of doing it when you're counting through an array. You will see this all over the place in challenges and resources that you look up online while you're learning JavaScript. And the other thing I'd say is, instead of like struggling to learn 4 different ways to write the loop, get good at writing it one way, right? And then once you're comfortable with it, then you can start branching out to different ways of doing that. So all right, and that is it for loops. So it's 7 o'clock. I've been running my mouth for an hour now. Does anyone have any questions about any of the loops that I just covered? All right, and if it seems like I just threw a lot at you in like the last half hour right there, like things kind of took a turn for the worse when I got to loops, don't worry about it. Don't panic. We're going to be talking about loops a lot, right? So like when we look in here, like I said, the first couple challenges are just dealing with different data types. They're fairly straightforward, but then we're going to start running into looping, and not all of them even mention loop, but like most of these challenges and pretty much everything you do on the second page, you're going to get some practice with loops. Almost any challenge that you hit with like an external challenge, like if you're going to Hacker Rank or Leak Code or Coding Dojo or whatever, like, I mean, loops are everywhere. They make up a huge part of coding. All right, so it's 7:03. Let's go ahead and take a quick 6-7 minute break. So let's get back at 7:10. And if anyone's got any questions for me, we'll answer them then before we get going. But I'm going to pause the recording and drink some water. And I'll see everyone in about 6 or 7 minutes. All right, everyone, welcome back from the break. We are at 7:22 p.m. Central Time on Wednesday, August 16th. So we just covered a review of functions. We talked about control flow, so if and else statements. We talked about iteration, which is for loops and while loops. And now we're about to talk about built-in methods. All right, so built-in methods are common actions that we perform on specific data types, and most languages have built-in methods, functions that allow us to perform these actions. Right, so if I have a state and it's all in lowercase, and I want to basically show in all uppercase, there is a function already built into JavaScript that somebody has written in as part of the core language, that all I have to do is reference my variable, add a dot, and then call the function on it, and it will take that action for me. All right. And same thing, someone on the first night mentioned push and pop, right? So we have built-in methods for arrays. So if I have an array called grades, and I call the push built-in method, it will add an array, or it'll add an element to the end of the array. So if I push 5 into grades, now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then same thing, let GPA is 3.1 and repeating 6 off into infinity. And I can use toFixed, which will then truncate the decimal place down to 2 decimal places. And then I can console.log new GPA, and I will see 3.17. And toFixed, like I can put in 4, and then it would say 1.667, and so on. So that's flexible. All right, and strings, numbers, arrays, and objects. So these are all data types that we've talked about, all have various built-in methods on. All right, and that's pretty much all we're going to dive into it for right now. We are going to talk more about it. Like I said, I believe session 3, we start hitting built-in methods for arrays, and then session 4, we'll do built-in methods for objects. The other thing I will throw out to you, and so when you search for something, just like anything else out there as far as information, there is high quality information and there is low quality information. There are lots of, I mean, especially with learning JavaScript, because it's so many people's first language, there are so many different places that will pop up to give you answers. I highly recommend that while you are looking up things pertaining to built-in methods and how to use them, that you use MDM or MDN, which is the Mozilla Developer Network. So Mozilla are the people who built Firefox, and MDN is basically the source of truth for all things JavaScript, right? Like if it exists, it's in these documents somewhere, right? And that includes, so like if I want to look at js.pop, right? And so array.prototype.pop, that's what I'm looking for, right? There's also the W3 schools, which that one's good. I don't know anything about JavaScript, tutorial.net. Geeks for Geeks is decent sometimes, but like they've got a lot of pop-up ads, and sometimes they get really obscure with the examples that they use. I've never heard of Flexible, right? These are all different sites that are offering it. This is the top result. It'll almost always be the top result. It'll definitely be in the top 5 every time. I highly recommend that you get used to going to MDN web docs and getting used to their format. right? So we talked about dot pop is to add something to the end of an array, right? And, or I'm sorry, that was dot push. So let's actually go to push, right? And if I look over here, I know that I'm on all the built-ins for array. Don't worry about prototype. It's basically just telling you that this is, you're using this with an array. So array and dot pop. We actually want array dot push because that's what we were talking about, but you can see array has a lot of different built-in methods on it. Right, so array dot push, the push method of an array instance adds the specified elements to the end of an array and returns the new length of the array. Right, so if I have an array animals and I want to push a new value cows into there, I can use animals.push and the value I want to. And then when I look back at that array, I will now see that there's 4 different values in there, including that. And you can use it to push in multiple things, right? So the next time we come back and do chickens, cats, dogs, and we look at animals again, and now we've got pigs, goats, sheep, cows, which was the first push that we did. And then we got chickens, cats, and dogs in the second time we did a push. All right. And so there's arrays, there's strings, numbers, and objects. Now, when you're first learning, and I still do like, and it's not just a first learning thing, I will try and do a push on a string, right? And sometimes like there are different data types that have the same built-in name, but a lot of times they are different. Like push and pop, I don't think you can run on string, and it'll yell at you. And when you do that, right, so if I say something like this, comment up here right now, and I say something like array cats dot push, say Nina, and then console.log array cats. No, cannot access array of cats before initialization. Where did I go wrong? Oh, because I still got this for loop. So notice, so I commented it out up here, and I'm still trying to access it right here, even though it's down here now. So notice it says reference error, cannot access array of cats before initialization at object, right? And then anonymous, blah, 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 blah. But then line 79. So it tells me, hey, you screwed up. You screwed up on line 79, and you screwed up because you're trying to access array of cats on line 79 before you actually declare it down here on line 87, right? So my error messages are trying to guide me to help me locate where I made a mistake. All right, so I'll just comment this out for right now, and I'll run this. Right, so now I have Mo, Todd, Nugget, and Nina. And I'm pretty sure if I look at string, right, and I come over here and I look in alphabetical order, right? So string goes from pad start to raw. So if I were to do something like, let's close this down, and close that down, and we say, and I say first name dot push, and my last name, right? Type error. First name dot push is not a function, right? So it's not telling me because I'm trying to do it on a string, like explicitly, but I am trying to use a built-in method that does not exist for a string. And that's what it's telling me, that this is not a function. Like there is nothing called dot push that I see anywhere here or built in to the JavaScript language. Right, and so that's just kind of like a little bit of a warning for you. So I'll get rid of that, and we can comment this back out. Or add it back in. So any questions on just the real high level stuff that we did on built-in methods? Okay. All right, and problem solving. So this, and again, this is going to be a rolling, continuous discussion throughout class and your career as a software developer. So understand what the problem is asking you to do. How many inputs are required? What data types are we working with? What's the expected output? What's the data type of our output? Give examples of the inputs and the expected output. Do I need any other variables to make this happen? Break down the problem into smaller problems. This is huge, right? Like this is the biggest thing. Like, let's make that orange. Let's highlight it. If I could make it blink for some reason, I would, right? Like, break down the problem into smaller problems. I am going to give you problems, and all of them can be reduced down into the basic building blocks that we've talked about so far in class. It is going to be up to you to determine what building blocks are needed, and then how you will string them together if multiple building blocks are needed, right? Do I need to use iteration and or control flow? The other thing is, and I haven't had the opportunity to do this yet, but like when we start solving multi-step problems, run your code often, right? If you have 10 steps to solve a problem and you write 8 of those steps or what you think is the right answer to those 8 steps, and then you run your code and something's broken, you have 8 different steps that you have to go back and trace through, right? So when you get a problem, it seems like one step, right? Like, solve the problem, but we're going to take that problem, we're going to break it down into smaller problems, and then we're going to solve one of those problems at a time. And each time we solve one of those problems, we're going to run our code to make sure that we're getting what we think we're getting, so that we're moving to the next part of the problem with solid footing. All right, so debugging, very important skill. Read and understand traceback errors. A traceback error is exactly this. This is a traceback error. It's telling me the type of error, what's causing the error, and where the error is located. All right. And then lastly, Google. Notice multiple times, and like sometimes I've called it out, like when we just talked about MDM. But if you've noticed, in the first 2 nights of class so far, I have made multiple mistakes while I was coding. Sometimes I knew the answer. Sometimes I had to go Google it just to refresh myself really quick. Like, okay, that didn't work the way I thought it would. Like, how do I do that? But it is important when we Google that you take into account the quality of the data that you're getting. The very easy kind of beginner stuff that we're working on, you'll almost always get good data for it. As your problems get more complex and more rare, it is much easier to find out-of-date data or incorrect answers, or maybe an answer where the code works, but it's still not the best solution out there. So always, like I said, like when you're at this stage, don't just click on the top result every time. Again, you're always safe to go with Mozilla. But like, I mean, if you got something that looks like this, right, and you don't know any of these websites, don't just like pick one and hope. Like, pick it, read it, see if it makes sense, maybe pick a second one, try and confirm what you're about to do with your code. All right, and that is it for the stuff that carried over from from Monday night. Are there any questions before I hop into the stuff for tonight? And again, the stuff for tonight is only going to take a few minutes.
Just one question, where are the videos held at for this course?
The videos are also right in here. I dropped the link for the Intro to Coding Live playlist. Right, so there's week 1, day 1, right? So tonight when this is over, like the videos end up being like 2-3 hours long, so it takes a while for Zillow, or not Zillow, Zoom to like basically convert it into a file format, and then I have to go in and upload it to YouTube, and then it takes another hour or two for that to make it a YouTube viewable format. But once it's in there, you can click on it. One of Intro to Coding, right? And there we go. And you will have, like, these never get pulled down. So you'll always have access to this if you save the link to the playlist. And I'll drop that in the chat again right now. And as well as it is in the Intro to Coding channel.
Thank you.
No worries. I'm pumped. I got 105 views. I'm almost famous. Check that out. I'm probably like 95 of them. All right. So session 2. And basically this is a REPL intro, and we've already been fairly well introduced to the REPL. What I am going to do though is call out a couple of different things here, both in REPL and also in Slack, that will help you out. All right, so let's come back up here and look at something where, so let's look at our for in. So how many times does key appear in our little loop right here, right? So we've got 1. We've got it in a string, which I don't want, but we've got it right here. We've got it right here. We've got it right here. So we've got it 4 times. This is going to screw up my demonstration. I'm just going to delete it for right now because I don't want to replace it yet. But if anyone noticed that sometimes this is not like typing in like a normal like Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever. So your IDE has some features that try to help you out, right? So notice how if I come in here and I highlight key, right? So there's key. Notice key is highlighted here, it's highlighted here, and it's highlighted here, right? So it is telling me there are multiple versions of this in here. And because what I don't want to do is say like, hey, I come in here and I say, I want to change this to hamburger, right? And so now I've got key, hamburger, and key, and I'm out of sync, and I've caused an error in here, right? And so this is my IDE trying to save me from making a mistake. I can also highlight something. So on your PC, it is Control D, Control Delta. On a Mac, it is Command D, Command Delta. There is multi text select, right? So I can hit this and notice how it's turning brown, and you can see the blinking cursor. So I now have 4 cursors, right? So if I want to replace this, I've just replaced all of them with hamburger, which is not necessarily the best name for this, but it will still run because it's just treating hamburger as a key, because I could name this whatever I want to, and as long as they all line up, it will continue to work, right? And so in Replit, I think like when you click away, it takes you out of multi-select mode, which is good. Not all IDEs will, but also if you just like hit the up and down arrow keys to navigate, notice I've still got a bunch of cursors here, right? So it's very easy to start messing with things when you've got multi-cursor mode. You can also just hit the escape button to exit out of that. So I wanted to cover that. That is something that can help you avoid errors and help speed things up. And so I'm going to grab this exact same thing here. Right. So now if you were to ask for help in Slack, right, you can take code and you can dump it into Slack, right? So I just threw that in there. That is hard to read. It's all one color. It's not formatted. It's not in like the courier stuff. So it's not super helpful when you do that, especially with larger chunks of code, right? So we're going to edit this. And what you can do is in Slack, if you do 3 back ticks. So again, that top left key with the tilde is the back tick. 1, 2, 3. Notice how I get a little box, and this is now I'm inside of a code block. And if I paste it now I get formatting, right? So this looks a lot more like it would inside our Replit or inside VS Code. And this makes it easier for people to read your code when they're trying to help you, right? So I'm sure if I scroll up in here, right? So like, I mean, here's some stuff this is still a small one. And it's the same thing here too. Like this is perfectly fine. But like, if you drop a screenshot in here, like I can't highlight, and because like a lot of times if you come to me with a problem, I may know the answer off the top of my head, but if I don't, I want to grab this code and I want to put it into a Replit myself. And I can't do that, or one of the self-paced TAs can't do that if you drop an image in there. And same thing. I don't have to go too far, but like people have definitely dropped some larger chunks of code in here without any formatting. But again, same thing with this, like all I have to do is right click. And is it not giving me a copy code block? Yeah, copy this code block, right? And then by doing that, I've selected it and it grabbed the whole code block for me and I can paste it somewhere, or anyone else is trying to help, you can do that. If the next step past this, and because Slack messages have a maximum length, and I don't ask me what that maximum length is off the top of my head. There is, and I don't know if anyone has picked up on all the Slack stuff yet, or if you use it for work, but you can use Giphy, right? So, all right, we can do things like that, which probably is like the single most used Slack function on the face of the planet. But any Slack function, like if you start a line in Slack off with a /, it'll start giving you all the different types of things that you can do with it. And what we want to look at is /snippet and create a text snippet. And this will take a much longer section of code. The other thing you can do to it is then pick a language. So, well, say JavaScript. How about Node? Well, you guys are killing me. Where are we at here? Now we'll just, really, there's no JavaScript in here. Right, and so when we do that, it's actually going to give some formatting similar to what we would have, right? And so we can create a snippet. It'll take a second to populate here. Right, and so it says click to expand 13 lines. Right, so I can look at this file. Now I've got line numbers, so I can tell you like, hey, you've got a problem on line 9. Right, or you've got a problem on line 3. This gives you full color, makes it much easier to troubleshoot when you're working with someone in Slack. All right, and so we'll delete the file. We'll delete my awesome GIF. So let's go ahead, and also, I haven't done this yet, but you can also do a multi-line comment. Right, so then lastly, right, so in a single backtick, right, and that gives you the inline formatting. Right, and all of those are ways to help make your coding more readable when you're working in Slack. All right, and that'll be added to the notes, so you have it for future reference. And so let's hop right into the formatting and clean code. All right, so proper formatting of code, if you remember anything, just be consistent. Proper variable names, descriptive naming, we've talked about that quite a bit. The name of the variable should make it clear what the data represents, right? So we talked about that, like I can name my variables ham and cheese, but that doesn't help me determine what those variables are doing unless I'm literally naming different types of ham and cheese, right? And so we want to, like, the rare exception to using a single letter variable is right up here inside of a for loop, right? I is acceptable, like that is the standard, everyone knows what I is, but you should absolutely avoid single character variables like let X equal something, or like let A equal right. So like these do not help tell a story of what this value should, what the value should be. All right. And all right, and let's see here. And that is it for session 2. So like I said, that one will only take a couple of minutes. So any questions up until this point? All right, so we have some decisions to make as a class. Now, there are a couple ways that we can solve challenges, and it has varied from class to class because I let the class kind of pick, and I do try and switch it up a little bit, so we won't always do it the exact same way. But we do have basically how the nights will go going forward is I will typically solve a challenge, and then I will break the class out into groups to solve a challenge, right? And then we'll come back and then we'll solve it together. Now, that can be groups like pairs, like groups of 2. I can do groups of 3 or 4, which is usually a little bit better. Just in case like someone's away from their keyboard or something like that. Or I mean, it's just more people working on the problem is typically easier to get solutions when you're first starting up. What I ask of you as far as your level of participation is that one person shares their screen, and it can switch each time. It can be the same person each time, whatever your group's comfortable with. The groups will change from night to night, but usually within the evening, like they'll stay the same once I set up breakout rooms. If you have solved the problem before, right? So like if you've gone through the intro to coding, like pre-recorded session, or if you've just randomly come across the problem before, feel free to help other people out, but don't just like cough up the answer where no one has to learn anything. So feel free to help guide your group, to give nudges, but make sure that it's still an environment where everyone gets a chance to learn. Because if you just slam down the answer and say this is the answer, no one in the group is really being forced to stretch or to build new brain cells. All right, so that being said, the first handful of challenges are pretty straightforward. They will take, I mean, solving them is, I mean, like I said, it's pretty straightforward. Like we were going to be working and doing a couple of things with strings. After the first couple of challenges, little wrinkles will be thrown in here and there. As a class, do you want me to lead the first challenge and then turn you to one in groups, or do you think you want to tackle the first challenge as groups right off the bat? And I'm okay with either option.
Solve the first one.
Who solves the first one?
You.
Okay. All right. So if there's anyone that dissents with that, let me know. If not, I'll start to pull up what we need to do to solve the first challenge. All right. So let's go ahead. Let me close this and this. Keep that open. We'll come over here. All right. So the first challenge is first name plus last name. We're dealing with types. All right. So you will click on the link. It will open up a new tab with a replet on it. This is not a replet that you own or that you can edit. This is a replet that belongs to the Code Platoon administrator, which is not me. And then you will need to, sorry, replet's taking its sweet time over here. You will need to make a copy of the replet, kind of just like what I talked about yesterday. You will need to fork it, and then you will own a copy of it, and you can make your own changes, and you have that saved to your own account. What is going on here? I think Replet's having some issues right now. There we go. All right, so it's still loading here. But we get, so like I said, you will come into this first page. This is the replet. You will need to fork it, which is you will be creating your own copy of this. All right, and so we'll fork it. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm not
Clear.
getting laggy or anything, so I don't think it's my internet connection. I think there's actually something going on with the Replit website. Because normally it should just pop up. So why don't we do this? It's 8 o'clock or it's 7:58. Let's take a scheduled break here until 8:05. So get some water, stretch out if you need to, and hopefully I'll have gotten this loaded up and pulled up at 8:05 or when we come back at 8:05. All right, everyone, it is 8:09 p.m. Central Time, Wednesday, August 16th, night 2 of the Intro to Coding Live JavaScript. We are back from break and we are about to hop into our first challenge. All right, so in the Slack Intro to Coding, in the Zoom chat, and also at the top of my response here, we have a multi-line comment here called prep, which is parameters, return, example, and pseudocode. So parameters are the inputs that we put into a function, right? So it looks like we've got a couple of parameters right here. The return is what we want out of the function. And so it looks like we've got some little tests mocked up down here. And I'll explain what these look like or what these do in a minute here. But it looks like the gist of this is that we're taking a first name and a last name as separate parameters, and we want to return one full name as one string, right? And so there's our return. We've got some examples right down here of what that looks like. And then lastly, we need to write the pseudocode. So the steps that we'll take to finish the challenge here. All right. Also, every time you fork one of the challenges from the CP admin, there's going to be 2 files. There's going to be the index.js where we do all the work, and that's really where I've been keeping my notes and what we're used to seeing. There's also going to be a README. All right, and the README will have a small description of the challenge. So in this one, write a function that takes your first name and last name as arguments and returns your first and last name as a single string. Example, full name, Michael, comma, Jordan, would return a value, one string, Michael Jordan. All right. And so let's go ahead and do our prep work here. So I know that I have 2 parameters. Both of them are strings, right? So this is a string, right? So I'm seeing that this is a string, this is a string. All of these are strings down here, right? And the return is going to be one string that represents the first and last name. All right. And the example, we're just going to say see below. And for the pseudocode, right, we're going to take our first name and last name params and add them into one string, right? So and anyone run across what you call it when you add 2 strings together in computer science terms?
Concatenate.
Concatenation.
Yep, concatenation. I made it like 37 years in my life before I ever heard what that was. It took me like another year to figure out what it meant. Right. And so to concatenate two strings is to add them together. The process is concatenation. And if you ever see the shorthand for it is just concat. And so if you ever hear someone say, yeah, we're going to concat something, that just means that you're going to add it together. All right, take two and sew it into one. All right, and then all right, so step one, add these two together. Step two, return the string. So like I said, this one's fairly straightforward. So let's go ahead and first off, we'll say let full name equal first name plus last name. All right. And we can start by console.logging this. All right. And so we'll do full name. And what do people think we're going to see over here in the console when we do this?
Nothing.
First name, last name.
Yeah, we'll see first name, last name. Do you think it'll look like this?
No, it'll be
No.
together, no space.
Yep. So no space. It's all going to be jammed together. Right. So Michael Jordan. And we're seeing, because we've got console.logs down here where we're comparing the output of this function to this string and we're getting false. Because right now, is there a return statement inside my function? No, right? So what is my function actually returning? What does this part, this left side of this comparison evaluate to? Is it evaluating to Michael Jordan with no string or with no space in it?
No, just
That's-
return a Boolean.
I'm sorry, you're correct when you said no, but I didn't hear what the rest of what you said was.
You just return like a Boolean. It's comparing the two equal signs. If
No,
they-
well, this whole thing right here. So this returns a Boolean and this is returning false. But just the left side, because I have no return statement, this is turning into undefined, right? So I'm saying console.log, the result of undefined strictly equal to Michael Jordan, which is false, right? And so it can be a little misleading because I've got my console.log right here. And obviously this does not look like this, so we know it's going to be false. But this statement is never even seeing my misshapen string up here, right? And so to fix that, I can do something like this, right? So now I've added a space in, right? So now when I do it, I've got Michael Jordan, right? Like this looks just like this. This is a string, this is a string, but I'm still getting false. And that is because I am just console.logging up here still. So at the end of the day, what this looks like with that console.log and no return is undefined triple equals to Michael Jordan, right? And this will return false, even though my console.log makes it look like the function is doing the same thing, right? So I know that my string is the way I want it to look right now, which is good. So I can take this, move it out of the console.log, and I'm going to return it, and I'm going to return full name, right? So now I am not sending full name to the console anymore. So I won't see Michael Jordan and Tom Preet and Ada Lovelace. I'm just going to see these three console.logs down here, which now console.log true, right? Because now I'm getting Michael, comma Jordan. I'm adding them together into one string with the appropriate space, and then I'm returning it out of the function. So now when this function executes and it returns its output or its return value, we're now saying this, right? And this becomes a true statement. And Tom Preet This, it's, if it works for one, it's gonna work for all of them in this instance, right? Because they're all doing the same thing. So we get our 3 true values. So this is like a fully working solution. Does anyone have any thoughts on how we could maybe do this a little bit cleaner?
Well, I was gonna say, do you actually have to define the let full name? Could you just say return, and then parentheses instead of an equal?
Yep, so the first thing I could do, right, because this is pretty straightforward, I see what I'm doing, I don't necessarily need to define this on its own line. So I could take something like this. And I'll copy this and I'll just comment these two out. Oops. And we'll just call this our first pass. Right, and that's a perfectly valid solution. This will be our second pass. Right, and so we could actually just go from there straight to here. Right, and what's another way that I could make this even a little bit cleaner?
A template literal.
Yep, the string literal or the string interpolation, right? So I can do something like this. Right, and I'm going to use the backticks, and then I'm going to reference my first parameter, put a space in there, and then reference my second parameter. So now it looks more like a normal sentence structure, right? And I still get my truths. So, and now we went from 2 lines and some weird stuff to more of a natural reading style on 1 line. Any questions about the prep, about what I did here with any of this?
So I wanted to ask about in the first pass, when you put, let full name equal first name plus the space plus last name. I was just wondering, because I expected that to come false because you didn't put first name and last name as strings, or does it automatically do that, or how does?
Right, so remember, this is just a parameter, this is a label. And it's a label that is dynamic. So we called the function 3 different times here, right? So the first time through, basically the computer takes this function, saves it to memory, right? Comes down here, and then it gets down here and it hits its first function call. And it says, okay, let's actually execute the full name function. And we're going to give it the first parameter is Michael, the second parameter is Jordan, right? So even though we read it like this, what the computer ends up seeing is full name Michael, comma Jordan, right? And then full name equals Michael as a string plus a string with 1 space in it plus a string of the last name Jordan. Right, and we're assigning it to this label, full name, which is all 3 of these at all 3 of these separate strings added together as 1 string. Right, and if I pop this out of the comparison real quick, right, and if I run this, so now I'm console.logging the output of full name Michael Jordan, right, and we get that string. And it'd be the same thing if I do this, if I pop it out of the comparison, we get Tom Pre, right? And so this is just a label that represents this string value. And every place we see this label, we can read it as Michael the first time through. And then the second time through, we would read it as Tom, right? And the third time we call it, first name is actually going to resolve to Ada. Does that help clear it up a little bit?
My question was a little bit different, but while you were explaining it, I did figure it out. So my question was for line 12, how, you say let full name equals, and the space is in string is, is with the, um, you put it in as a string, but first name and last name are not put in as a string. I was wondering why that worked, but then I realized that in the test, you assign the parameters as a string. So I get it
Correct.
now.
Yeah, right.
It,
Because it's the same thing. Like
Yeah.
with JavaScript being dynamic, like I could change this to 5 and 10. And the function's still going to work. It's going to do something funky, right? Like it's going to take 5, and because we're taking a number and adding it to a string, JavaScript is automatically converting the number to a string, and then it's converting this number to a string, and then we get 5 space 10 as a string, right? And so, like, it isn't explicit. Like, if we were writing TypeScript, right, like I would have to say something like first name string, right? And like this is going to blow up on me because Replic's not going to know how to handle it. But you actually have to tell it what data type you're actually using. And in JavaScript, you don't have to do that. And that's why it's easier to like, so JavaScript is easier to learn than a strongly typed language, but it's easier to screw up in because there are no guardrails. Like there is nothing stopping me from putting numbers in here, right? Or I mean, if I put Booleans in here, I don't know if it'll create a, like if it'll convert that to a string or not, right? So it converts false, but notice how it's white, so we know it's all in a string. So all of these are just getting converted to strings. And so this is an abnormal behavior, and we don't want our function to do this, but in JavaScript, we're basing it on the fact that we're going to get good input, as that we're going to get good output.
so even though you didn't type false in as a string, JavaScript just did that on its own to make that a
It-
string.
As soon as you add something else to a string, it'll convert that into a string as well.
Okay.
Right. And so it can be confusing, but that's just how JavaScript works. It's also like, I mean, Python will do it, like the dynamic languages will do that, right? Like there's no type protection there. All right, so that is pretty much the solution for the first one. And so now we are going to look at the second one. All right, so let's go ahead, and the second one, I believe, is the total change due. I wasn't just like clicking around on that. And this one is going to be very similar to the first one, but again, what you'll find is that like each challenge will be similar to the one before, but they're going to add a new wrinkle to it. All right. And so we've got a function of total change, and I would ask that as people fork this and copy it over, that you paste in that little prep blurb at the top of your fork, right? And I will walk through the prep work for everyone on this one so that you've got a rough idea of what it is. And then we've got, oh, what we got here, 10, 15, and roughly around like 20 some participants. So I'll probably break everyone out into groups of 3 or 4, depending on how the math works out, and give everyone so it's 8:30. I'll give everyone about 20 minutes to work on it. And what I would ask is that if your group finishes or gets an answer, because you're going to be in a breakout room, you won't be able to chat with me directly in Zoom, is that have someone in your group send me a Slack message on the Code Platoon Slack. All right, so I have 2 parameters, right? And it looks like they're both going to be numbers here. we have not dealt with this yet. Does anyone know what type of number this is?
A floating.
Yep. So when you see decimal points, this is a floating point number. And so they get a little bit of different treatment than just a whole number in most programming languages. And that is a clue to a little bit about the wrinkle that you're going to run into here on this challenge. All right, so we are going to return one number. You'll see below. I'm going to be kind of generic with this. All right, so that's where we're at. And I'll take this and drop it back into here. So that is in the chat. People can feel free to grab that. Give me 1 second here. All right, everyone, welcome back from your very first challenge, Total Change Due. I saw some chatter about that there was some some questions that were popping up, especially with the second test case, where we were dealing with a float. And so let's go ahead and jump into this here real quick. So we know that we are getting two parameters, both are numbers, amount paid and total cost. And we need to return one number that is the difference between the paid and the cost. So let's go ahead and say, we'll go say let difference, or we'll just call this change due, right, is going to be equal to the amount paid minus the total cost. All right, and then we're going to skip because we know that console.logs don't necessarily work in here. We're going to go ahead and go straight to our return, and we're going to return change due. So let's go ahead and run this. Oops, amount pad and amount paid. All right, so we get a true and we get a false, and it sounds like a lot of people ran into that same situation. So let's go ahead and for right now, just pop our console.logs out of the test. So we're seeing the values that we're actually returning, right? And we get 25 and $2.71 and rounding way off out into nowhere cents. And that is because of the way that computers and hardware computer can actually deal with floating numbers and precision. I will copy and paste a link to an article that talks exactly about this down below. So when you come to basically like take a copy of the notes from the night, when I post them in there, you'll have an access to that, and that's some reading for you. You don't really have to understand why or read it if you don't want to. It's interesting, or if you find it interesting, you can. You just need to know that computers oftentimes struggle with precision with decimal points. So it makes it harder to work with things like money. All right. So now and someone that didn't necessarily solve it, but made it past this step, what was the next step that you took?
We tried two fixed,
Okay,
but then it
so
but then it made the okay, go ahead.
Let's try two fixed, right? And I believe I'm just going to do two, right? And so I hit the dot, and it's going to start giving me different methods that are available. Again, this is the IDE trying to help me develop. So let's bump down number, two fixed, fraction digits. So like that's what I put in, undefined, and then string, right? So returns a string representing a number in fixed point notation, right?
Mhm.
So we are limiting it to the number of decimal points that we want, but we are converting our number to a string, right? And because we're doing strictly equal, that is where probably a lot of people got bumped in the challenge, right? Like if we just had that, it would pass, but because we're no longer checking the type, right? So let's go ahead and do two fixed. And remember, numbers will show up as a gold over here, strings will show up as white, right? And so now I'm seeing the 25.00, the 2.72, and it's all in white, right? And so I would still, now I'd get false for both of these. So if I pop this out, oops. Let's go here, right? And I run this. All right, now I'm to false false because I'm checking strings against numbers. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So now I would come in here and I would say JS, how to convert string to number. And it looks like I've typed this in a couple of times before because it already knows. All right, so dev community, free code camp, blah, 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 W3 docs. I don't see MDM in here. So let's do MDN. Right. So parse int. Okay. So parse int. This gets us closer. So parse int function parses a string argument, returns an integer. Or an integer is a whole number. Right. So that's going to cut us off. But if we look over here, what do we see right next to parse int? We see parse float. And we know coming back over here, that this was a floating point number over here, right? So now, how do I use parse float? The parse float function parses a string argument and returns a floating point number, right? So let's look in here. So we take, we've got the circumference thing. So parse float R, right? So we're feeding in R, we're parsing it to a float, we're multiplying. So I just need to wrap my number or my string inside of this parse float, right? So let's come over here. So now I need to take this whole thing. We'll put another set of parens around it and we'll go parse float. Right, and I believe that this should work now. Right, so let's run it. And we're back here. These are gold again. So we're actually back to numbers. So let's see what happens when we delete these. True and true. Right. And so we didn't solve this all in one shot. I didn't write all of this code, hit the run button and hope for the best. I solved this one step at a time. Right. And then I wrote some code. I got to a breakpoint. I ran it. I saw what I was getting. I then looked up what I needed to do next. The first time I asked what I needed to do next. And then I did that and I didn't do all of it in one shot. I just basically got my two fixed, saw that that converts it to a string. Then I figured out how do I turn a string back into a float with JavaScript, and I added the third step to my solution, right? So limit the number of decimals. Make sure I am comparing numbers to numbers, right? And so those are my steps. So I need to get my two fixed. I need to get my parse int, then I need to return the answer. I get my trues. It is 9 p.m. Central Time. Class is basically over. I will leave the recording running here for a couple of minutes. If anyone's got any specific questions about what I did about this. And then once we're done with any questions about this and people don't have to hang out, they can catch up on the video later if they'd like to. I'll turn off the recording and I'll have an informal Q&A session if anyone wants to hang out and ask me anything else about life. So any questions about the steps I took to solve this problem? And I see one hand up.
I have a question. So, um, my group, we were really close. I'm glad we were close, but I guess maybe we were hung up thinking that there might have been a way for us to just take the number and and basically not have to take it to a string and then convert it back to a number. Is there no way of doing that, or you would have to do it this way? There's not a better way to do it.
So you may be able to do it by multiplying your way out of it, I think. But it wouldn't be as clean. So like if we did, we'll just call it this. I'm not picking good names right now, but we would say amount paid times 100, and then let num2 equal total cost times 100. And this way we're taking the decimal points out of these, right? So it would be like 1,728 at that point, right? And like the decimal points go away. And then we could say return num1 minus num2. And maybe we can divide this whole thing by 100. I'm not sure if this works or not, or if we end up back with the same decimal point problem, but we can check it out here real quick. Right, so this would work as well. Right, because what we did by multiplying both sides by 100 is we took the decimal points completely out of the equation when we did the subtraction. So we actually subtracted 1,000 minus 728, and then took 272 and divided that by 100, and we got around the imprecision and the decimal point counting that way as well. So this would be a valid answer as well.
Except if you have more than 2 decimal places, right?
Right. So if you were a bank where you started dealing with very precise numbers, it would be an issue. But like if you were building like a cash register app where you don't have fractional pennies, it wouldn't be an issue, right? So it just depends on the situation. And I like this solution better as what I would refer to as an idiomatic solution.
You mean by idiomatic solution?
The way JavaScript wants you to do it.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep. I see another hand up.
Yes, I have a question basically about I got lost when you went to parse integer or like parse int, and then but when you did it, it says parse float. So I think I missed something.
Yeah, so when I was like, I did a search for JavaScript, how to convert a string to a number.
Mhm.
And when I did that, the search result was parse int. Right, the parse float is down here. And so if I run parse int, what that does is that will get rid of all of my decimal places. Right, so this is an integer. Any number that's a whole number is an integer, and any number that has a decimal point in it is a floating point number.
Right.
The data type is they're both numbers, but that's an integer, that's a float. And so it was just basically how I phrased the question, brought me to parse int, which is not the right answer, right? Like this tells me it'll basically return an integer. But then I looked over here and saw that the one right next to it is parse float. And I know that I want to float, right? And so I clicked on it and then looked up the instructions on how to use parse float.
In our group, we got really, really close. We were looking at parse float and parse int. I think looking back at the problem, I think what threw us off, another thing that threw us off was I think we thought we needed to put like an extra line in there for the floating number before the return.
I'm sorry, an extra what?
An extra line in it, like let something equal da 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 before.
Okay.
To deal with the floating number. But I see how you put it all together in one. Is just cleaner and it's neater this way.
Yeah, and I could have cut down a little confusion, and I was in a bit of a hurry. If I would have asked my question to Google better, which is also an important thing. Like if you ask Google a question and it looks at you like you don't know what you're talking about, you're probably asking it the wrong question. And that getting good at asking Google questions is going to be important as you become a developer. So what I should have asked it is JS, how to convert string to floating number in MDN. And then now see basically like my top results are parse float. Which is
Yes.
where I wanted to go in the first place.
Okay.
All right, guys, and girls and everyone else. Is there any other questions directly related to the challenge? If not, I am going to pause the recorder or pause the recording for the evening.